Hello, so in this video I'm going to do a walkthrough of the 2017 Edexcel History A Level Paper 1, Option 1C Britain 1625 to 1701, and in this video I'm just going to do Section A. Obviously in the exam you just do one question from section A, but I'm going to do both of them here, just so they're both done. And the purpose of this video is that it's a revision video, so I'm not going to go into the content in lots and lots of detail. It's as if I'm kind of in the exam and I'm planning these, although it might be a little bit longer than you might. You might just put aside 5 minutes in the exam. It might go on a little bit longer than that. Let's see. So, the other thing, sorry, the last thing to say before I get started is obviously I'm offering an approach. I'm not saying this is the only approach. I'm not saying it's even the best approach. It's just an approach to these questions. So if you can think of a different approach, if you can think of a different argument, different structure, different piece of evidence, that's fantastic. That's the beauty of history, that we can all come at these things from a different perspective. So let's get going. Question 1. To what extent was Republican rule 1649 to 60 different from the personal rule of Charles I? So for this question, and for questions in general when you're in the exam, what I would strongly advise you to do is take a highlighter in there and kind of highlight or even just underline with your pen the key terms. Okay, so key bits here: Republican rule 49 to 60 and personal rule 29 to 40, and the key word here in the question is different. Okay, so this is a similarity and difference question. That's what we're thinking about. How similar, how different were these two periods? All right, so let's have a go at planning it. I would strongly suggest that when you're planning your essays, start with your argument. Okay, and I've got lots of other videos on exam technique that you can look at if you haven't seen those, where I talk about how to get an A star, how to write A-level essays. And I strongly advise you to start with your argument, because you should be linking to that throughout the essay. So for this question, to what extent was Republican rule different from personal rule of Charles I? I would maybe argue here that they were similar in some senses. For example, trying to establish a new religious settlement, and maybe financial goals, those kind of things. However, there were fundamental differences in approach. Okay, so that would be my argument, I think, for this. They're similar in some senses, like they both wanted a new religious settlement and they both had similar financial goals. However, there was fundamental differences in approach. Okay, so if we start off with paragraph 1, and this one is a different essay. It doesn't have a factor in the question, so you're not thinking, oh, it's talking about money or it's talking about religion or whatever. You've got to think of your own with this one, so it is quite tricky. So the paragraph that I would probably start with is on leadership. Okay, and what I talk about in this is that you've got Republican rule, which was Oliver Cromwell, but generally with some sort of parliament. Okay, and there's lots and lots of different experiments during the Republic. So you've got, to begin with, you've got the rump, and then you've got the nominated assembly, and then you've got the first protectorate, etc. Rule the major generals, etc. So, but I think a real key point here is that Cromwell is always ruling with some sort of parliament. Okay. However, Charles I was absolutist, okay, and relied on his advisors. He dissolved Parliament. That's the whole point of personal rule. So I would argue that there are some similarities. For example, you could look at Cromwell dissolving the rump in 53, but I think a fundamental difference in approach, linking back to my argument, is that Cromwell generally ruled with a parliament, whereas Charles was ruling on his own with a close group of advisors in this period. Okay, so that's what I would kind of talk about there, and I think there's enough evidence there to talk about there's different kinds of parliaments. Talk about Charles the First. You can maybe talk about belief in divine right. You could even mention some of the advisors, Lord Wentworth, those kind of people for Charles the First. Okay, paragraph 2. I think I would talk about religious policy because that's something I'd mentioned in my argument. I mean, you could potentially even start with that if you want to. So obviously, during the Republic, it was kind of Puritan led, but with toleration. So there was Toleration Act of 1650 passed by the Rump, which allowed freedom of worship. Obviously not for everybody, not for Catholics, but this led to this explosion of kind of Protestant dissent, and you get the emergence of Quakers and Fifth Monarchists and Ranters, and although the Ranters actually had been persecuted slightly before that. But anyway, you get this explosion of Protestant dissent. And then you compare this to, so I'll put kind of versus Laudian reform of personal rule. So from 33 to 40, and you could talk about the things that Laud did, changing churches, etc. You could even talk about the prayer book in Scotland and this idea of kind of standardizing worship. So actually, the similarity here is both of these time periods wanted a new religious settlement, but the personal rule wanted to standardize worship, whereas the Republic didn't. However, I think a kind of counterpoint to that could be something like the rule of the major generals that did want this kind of godly reformation and did ban things. So there is a slight similarity there, but I would say that in general there is a difference. Okay, but overall they both did want a new religious settlement, didn't they? And then finally, there's lots of things you could mention as your third paragraph. You could mention ruling the three kingdoms, and you could talk about Scotland and Ireland and how they both approach that. I would maybe talk about finance. And I think you could talk about in both periods, the rulers, sought varying ways to raise money. And if we start off with Charles I this time, obviously we're talking about extraordinary revenue, we're talking about ship money, we're talking about the kind of soap monopoly, these kind of things, and you're going to say these things are kind of unpopular, and Charles tried to raise money without Parliament. In the Republic, you could talk about monthly assessment, okay, which was used to pay for the Anglo-Dutch War, which was very similar to ship money, but a similarity there might be that actually it was being used for what it should have been used for, whereas ship money maybe wasn't. And you could also talk about selling crown lands to raise money during the Republic, which is obviously different to during the personal rule. Okay, so that's how I would approach that one. I hope that makes sense. If any of it doesn't make sense, or you need me to clarify anything, or if you've got any questions or ideas, please just leave a comment and I'll respond as best I can. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second question now, and the question is, how accurate is it to say that religious nonconformity survived persecution during the Restoration, 1660 to 88, so from the Restoration to the Glorious Revolution, mainly due to the actions and attitudes of Charles II and James II? Okay, so religious nonconformity, that's what we're talking about. Surviving persecution. So why did religious nonconformity survive 1660 to 88? And it's giving you a factor, the actions and attitudes of Charles II and James II. Okay, so again, if I'm going to start with my argument for this one, I would say actions and attitudes, Charles II and James II offered symbolic support, okay, which undermined the harsh Clarendon Code, but I think the overall argument would be the failure of the Clarendon Code was the most significant reason for survival. Okay, and I'll come back to that in the essay overall. Okay, obviously I'm not, in both these questions, I'm not kind of planning out the intro context definition argument. I'm not planning that out in these quick plans. So just quickly, actions and attitudes. What did the monarchs do that led to the survival of nonconformity? So we're talking about Protestant nonconformity here. Really, we're talking about the declarations of indulgence. Okay, so Charles II issues 2, James II issues 2, and I've got a video on this topic if you want to go into those, but 62, 72, 87 and 88 are the dates of those, and you say that these offered symbolic support, and therefore nonconformists felt like they had support of the monarch, and perhaps that meant that the Clarendon Code was less likely to succeed. A good counterpoint for this actually is Charles II's persecution following the Rye House plot of 1683. Okay, so following the Rye House plot, which was by old Cromwellian soldiers, Charles II did clamp down on nonconformists as he saw them as a threat, and therefore that's a kind of counterpoint to this. So it can't, like right at the end of his reign, that can't have been a big factor because he was actually clamping down on them. Paragraph 2, I'd go with the one that I'm arguing, that it was the failure of the Clarendon Code. Okay, so the Clarendon Code was too narrow, and therefore allowed for nonconformists to flourish. And you could talk about the Act of Uniformity being too narrow. You could talk about something like the 5 Mile Act, 1665, which sends nonconformists out of towns, and therefore they're harder to keep an eye on. You could talk about the fact that locals didn't want to persecute their neighbours. You could also link it to what I'm going to talk about in paragraph 3, is talk about the kind of long-term impact of toleration during the Republic. But just talk about the different acts of the Clarendon Code and say how they were ineffective. Okay, I think that's pretty clear that the Clarendon Code didn't work, and therefore nonconformists were able to survive. This attempted persecution failed. Okay, paragraph 3, I would talk about long-term impact of toleration during the Republic. Okay, so you talk about the Toleration Act 1650, and I know this is outside of the question, but it is relevant in terms of answering the question, which is, as far as my experience goes, in terms of marking exams, as long as it's relevant to answering the question, it's fine. You're not talking about the Republic, you're talking about the impact the Republic had on this period. So you talk about the Toleration Act 1650, which led to the emergence of Quakers, Fifth Monarchists, lots of dissenting groups, and therefore those groups, particularly I think I'd probably focus on the Quakers here, were able to grow, and despite the persecution, attempted persecution, they were able to survive. So you could talk about the Quaker Act, you could talk about which was 1662, you could talk about George Fox being imprisoned for 2 years and coming out in the Quaker movement, surviving that. So I would say that this is it's kind of opening the box, and lots of nonconformity kind of grows and follows from this, and therefore the Clarendon Code can't succeed at putting the lid back on. Okay, so that will be my argument for that one. I am going to do sections B and C in the next couple of videos, so please stay tuned for those. But please leave a comment or a question if you've got any issues with any of this, anything that wasn't clear at all. Okay, thanks so much for listening.